Hello and welcome to episode 113 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're talking Major 3 Week 1 qualifiers. We're talking Major 4 not happening where it was supposed to be happening. We're talking a little bit of late buyout stuff from last season, which some really cool hypotheticals in this scenario. And then we'll be giving our predictions for Major 3 Week 2 for the qualifiers next week. But before we get to any of that, how you doing, Bink?
Doing all right. Very much the fastest turnaround I think we've had for an episode in terms of doing it as close to the end of the matches as I can remember, at least. But yeah, it was a quick week. Good to be back after a quick break, even if it was some online matches. Had a couple of close series today, though, at least. So ready to break it all down for you guys.
Yeah, the Call of Duty League stream was still up as of 20 minutes ago. So that the crossover that we definitely couldn't have. We can't be competing against each other. So I think it's off now, and we're in the clear. But let's get into it. Before we get into the matches though, let's talk about Major 4. So these are the Major 3 qualifiers that started this weekend. Major 4 was set, at least tentatively set, to be hosted by the Carolina Royal Ravens, who are in their first season in Carolina after being in London, technically for the first 4 seasons. So Major 4 was supposed to be hosted in Charlotte, but that is not going to happen now. The Royal Ravens announced, I believe it was on Thursday. Of course, as is tradition, this stuff kind of breaks right after we put out the podcast, so we don't get to talk about it on the podcast last week. But Carolina announced that due to a range of factors, they will not be hosting Major 4, and the CDL announced that it will take over hosting duties and it will host the 4th major without an audience in Burbank, California. And the major will take place a week later than previously scheduled. It was supposed to be June 20th to the 23rd. And now Major 4 will be in Burbank from June 27th to the 30th, again, without an audience. Your thoughts, Bink, because to me this sucks. Obviously, that's one less event that fans don't get to enjoy. We don't the even the viewing audience, we don't get the same kind of experience. So I assume you agree that it kind of sucks that this is happening again.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I had the same mindset last year. This happened last year, right? When they
Yeah, New
had it
York.
in Columbus.
Yep.
And glass half full outlook for it is at least it's still happening on land. Obviously, it sucks that there's no fans in attendance and all that. But an even worse outcome would be that the tournament was not hosted in Charlotte and then it moved to online. That would just be terrible. So, you know, silver lining, I guess, in all this is at least it's still happening on land, which is a positive if there can be a positive in the situation. But the other thing it has me thinking about is that we always have to wait for when champs is announced. Um, and with this being announced that Major 4 is happening in California, even though there's no fans, so I don't know how likely it is to have an impact on any champs decision, but you would assume most likely they wouldn't have back-to-back tournaments in California. I guess now that I'm saying it out loud, like you could in theory because there's going to be fans at champs, you would hope, and there's not in Major 4, so it doesn't really matter. But I would just be surprised if it's back-to-back tournaments in California. But who knows? They could have planned it a long time ago and uh, have a venue in Cali all ready to go, and then they had to pivot last minute here for the Major 4. So we'll have to wait and see in that regard. But it has me think at least leaning towards the notion that it's unlikely champs will be in California, which I know some players have even said in the past that California. I think it's something with taxes and the prize winnings and stuff. Like players always didn't like when champs was in California because like it would affect how much they actually
Hmm.
get to take home from prize winnings and that stuff. I don't remember the numbers, but I remember seeing some tweets and hearing some stuff about it over the years. Um, but yeah, regardless, It's unfortunate. Major Four won't be in Charlotte, especially for those fans. The London franchise just rebranded and relocated to Charlotte, Carolina, and probably some new local fans potentially. We're going to be excited to have a home event there, so it's unfortunate for them, unfortunate for anybody else who was planning on attending. Um, but yeah, well, not the first time it's happened, and like I said, there's obviously the doomsday scenario, if you will, where the event just gets outright canceled, I guess, or it gets moved online, and that would have been even worse than it's staying on land with no fans. So I guess you gotta take what you can, and that's the situation we're in now.
Yeah, with California, like in professional sports, if you're play the NBA or something, like you have to file taxes for what, like if you play a game in Toronto, you file taxes in Canada for that game. If you play a game in California, you're filing taxes in California. So obviously it is very difficult for them, maybe not as difficult for Call of Duty players who only play at max like 5 or 6 events a year. But yeah, California is going to take a chunk of that money. Whoever ends up winning, or whoever gets the earnings of that, they will have to pay quite a bit to the state of California, which obviously is not great. But the same kind of scenario happened last year, Major Four actually last year as well. New York was supposed to host the 4th major in the 2023 season. It didn't happen, and it ended up being in Columbus without fans and without media, because I was denied media access to that event. So very good, very very nice. It's great that I think it kind of harkens back to like an old like COD event, but without people standing behind others and kind of creating that atmosphere. It really does take away from what Call of Duty is and what esports are supposed to be. So unfortunate that it's happening, but like you said, at least we have another major. It's going to be on LAN, so competitively speaking, it should be relatively similar. But again, it's just a kind of another blow to the CDL and the franchises not being able to be stable enough to host a major. Like we only have, I think, 4 majors this season, right? And then champs. So we're really only getting 3 teams to host a major. And then the CDL is, footing the bill for this 4th major and champs, presumably. So not great, not what you want to see, but this is kind of the hand we're dealt with the CDL at the moment, and we're gonna keep on pushing. Let's talk about what PRED said on the Eavesdrop podcast. He was on Hex's podcast, and he kind of gave some insight into what was happening with him and Seattle before last season and early during the season last year. We talked about it at the time, but there were reports that OpTic had offered quite a bit of money to the Seattle Surge to buy out PRED's contract to bring him to OpTic. Early on in the season, Scump retired, Illy got benched. A lot of turmoil at the beginning of last year for OpTic, and they, at the time, there were reports that they offered him, or they offered Seattle a large chunk of money to get him to OpTic and out of Seattle. So Hex confirmed that this week on the Eavesdrop podcast. He said that OpTic offered Seattle $420,000 in terms of a buyout to bring PRED to OpTic. Seattle ultimately said no to that, and it did not work out very well for the team, although I do believe PRED and Seattle ended up eliminating OpTic from champs. So, it kind of works out, but not really. And PRED also revealed, which was not, we had not heard anything about this, I don't think. But PRED said that FaZe before last season, before the MW2 season, they offered $500,000 to Seattle to buy him out and bring him to FaZe. I would assume in place of Slasher, who ended up replacing Arcides before last season. And then Slasher this offseason was replaced by Draza coming from LA Thieves. So your thoughts on this? Because I think, I know at the time, at least I had the opinion that Seattle should turn down an offer if they believed that they could win a championship with PRED, because if they had sold Pred for $420,000 or whatever amount of money, that is just saying we care about the money, and the championship is a secondary goal for us. And that's fine if you want to make that clear. But I thought at the time that Seattle should try to go for a championship, considering they, I think, had a third place champs finished the year before. They had, I think, got to the grand finals at the first major last season, and then it kind of went downhill from there. But the FaZe thing is
Went
very interesting.
downhill after they, the rumors started. Really.
Yeah. So what are you thinking about this? Because, I mean, either one, Pred on OpTic last year or Pred on FaZe last year, would have been a real game changer, I think.
Yeah, and there was even discussions around Shotzi potentially going to FaZe, around this time, or maybe it was a little before. The big thing I take away from the FaZe component of it is that, whether it's his decision or what the organization seemingly thinks is the best, it seems like we're inevitably going to get to a point where Simp wants to be running a flex, or because that's ideally that's two SMG guys you're bringing in there, and potentially in terms of Shotzi and Fred, if you were able to make that happen, they would be running a sub alongside of BZ. Simp would be the flex, and then selling the main AR. So that's an interesting component of it. And obviously the roster moves that did come to fruition afterwards in terms of bringing in Slasher and then Draza this year, it's still Simp tech, quote unquote, in a sub duo. Just, this year is a little weird because there's some cases where you got 4 MCWs on the map for each team. But regardless, that's kind of the most interesting part of it for me from a FaZe standpoint. That team would have been absolutely disgusting, I feel like. So that would have been interesting, but obviously it's tough to say too, because FaZe did win an event last year. So that is, interesting. But the OpTic thing, that whole situation, I do think it, and Pred in the clip that you shared from the podcast, Pred seemed to give Seattle a shout out in terms of what you said, not making it about the money and trying to win. So that is kind of cool to see. But it's also a little interesting with hindsight to see how it all played out, and to think they could have potentially gotten a quarter or $500,000 when all said and done. But yeah, that'll probably be one of the bigger what ifs, but obviously it doesn't mean too much now that the at least not counting the FaZe component of it from an OpTic standpoint. As soon as we heard those rumors, it seemed inevitable that Pred was going to be on OpTic this year, right? It was just there was the stuff about the buyout increasing and all that, and it was just kind of it felt like a matter of time, and that's what ends up happening. And he's played pretty well for them so far. So worked out in that regard for OpTic, and outside of his salary, whatever that is, it saved OpTic quite a bit of money from the way it worked out, and might have cost them a couple championships if you think he comes into the team, and who knows, it could have even cost them some games with Scump, right? Because it sounded like that he really wanted to play with Seth, and obviously Scump retired prematurely when he had planned on retiring at the end of the year. If they're able to get Pred, maybe he sticks it out a little bit longer. Maybe he plays in some more tournaments. It's a whole big what if scenario that's kind of interesting to talk about. And yeah, at the end of the day though, he's on OpTic now, so it worked out in that regard.
Yeah, it's weird. Well, your point about him kind of giving a shout out to Seattle for emphasizing winning over money, it also sounded like it sounded like I would have been okay with moving to OpTic or FaZe, because Seattle, they didn't really do anything last year. They had a really good first major and then fell off the map.
I think it was pretty obvious from an outside perspective looking in. You can say there was some stuff going on behind the scenes that we never heard about. I think I remember there was rumors of them trying to get Clay at one point too, talking about Seattle. But obviously this is a while ago now, but I felt like at the time and in my memory of the entire timeline that once these rumors started coming out of PRED potentially going to OpTic, there was a noticeable, change in what was going on for Seattle, how they were playing. It's tough to say the chemistry was off because we don't have an inside look at the team and all that, but it felt like in a very uneducated way for me at least that there was a change in the camp after the rumors started coming out that Pred could potentially go to OpTic, and you know I just how much that actually is true and whatnot, because again, like you said, they did end up eliminating OpTic from champs. I'm pretty sure back-to-back years Pred did that and Seattle did that. So, um, end of the day, it's tough to say how much of a factor it really was, but I feel like in my recollection of that time, it's not a stretch to say that it had some impact.
Well, that happens in professional sports as well. Guys that are on the trade deadline or involved in these trade rumors mid-season,
Yeah.
that plays on people. Even if it's not you, maybe it's a teammate. Like it's a 4-person team in Call of Duty, and for Pred, who is Seattle's best player, to be kind of, I don't know if publicly flirting, but definitely like the reporting was probably not coming from Seattle. It was probably coming from OpTic or Pred's management or something, because I don't think Seattle, like, other than people saying, well, look at them, they're really trying to win, but like they got clowned pretty hard for, you know, reportedly turning down a bunch of money for Pred when he was going to be a free agent in the offseason. So like that part of it kind of plays a factor. I'm not entirely sure how much it played on Seattle's performance, but I wouldn't disagree with you that, well, just factually, they kind of fell off a cliff right after that. Second place at the first major, and then I don't think they really made it into like the top 6 until champs, which champs was like their best second best performance all season. I think they just barely squeaked into champs, into qualifying for champs at the last major of the season. So it's unfortunate for Seattle that it didn't work out the way that they had probably hoped. They probably wanted to win a championship and probably thought they could, because I don't think at the time there was any reason to believe that they weren't one of the better teams in the league, but it didn't turn out that way for the rest of the season, unfortunately for them. And OpTic were the beneficiary of at least Pred this past offseason. And FaZe, they ended up with a good replacement in Draza, considering they've won quite a few matches in a row and are the defending major champions at this point. But yeah, that does it for the match stuff. Let's get into the matches from the first week of the qualifiers. We only had 8, so not a lot to talk about in terms of quantity, but there were some really interesting matchups. Friday was not the interesting day. First match on Friday, April 12th, was Atlanta versus Minnesota. Unsurprisingly, 3-0 in favor of FaZe, again, the defending major champions. Minnesota coming in with a new roster with Gunless and Standy. So that was kind of the most interesting part of this match. What did you make of Standy? What did you make of Gunless? And unfortunately, what did you make of Minnesota getting 3-0'd by FaZe?
Yeah, I mean, it felt like that was, I think I forget exactly how you worded it last time we talked about it, but it's tough for, at least Gunless and Standy aren't rookies in the regard, but it's always tough for a new team to debut against one of the top dogs, let alone the team that just won the last event. I thought the first map of the series, which was our first look at Vista Hardpoint, Minnesota did a really good job of making it competitive early. Obviously, could be a case of some map pool testing going on, so we obviously don't know too much about how strong Atlanta is on that map or Minnesota for that matter. So, it felt like there was a lot of engagements on the map, and it from first initial perspective, I enjoyed it, and I definitely thought it was one early on where it looked like Minnesota was competing and had a chance to take the win, but Atlanta kind of just pulled away in the end, and then the rest of the series wasn't necessarily incredibly close. So Yeah, I mean, not much to say. We're gonna have to see more of the Minnesota squad against, not the top dogs to see how much we can gauge from the roster change, but the expected result here at the end of the day.
I mean, Gunless played well, statistically at least. He went 26 and 15 on control. Um, I mean, this is Minnesota has been one of the more disappointing teams over the last 6 weeks or so, since Major One, where they had that fourth place finish and shot up the standings. They've been on a downward slide, and it's going to take, if Gunless and Standy are going to be the solution to their problems, it's going to take more than a handful of matches in the first week against two of the top three or top four best teams in the league. It's unfortunate for them that it worked out that way, but at least, unless they play, OpTic and Toronto back to back this week, that at least they'll have a little bit easier of a schedule. They'll have gotten some of their more difficult matches out of the way early and can kind of build off of that. But we'll see what happens with Minnesota. I know we have another match to talk about for them coming up. Second match of the day was LAG versus Las Vegas. We both picked the Legion. They win 3-0. LAG, I don't know what their win-loss record is online now, but it's pretty abysmal. They are definitely Lanimals at this point. Anything that you took away from this 3-0 sweep from the Legion?
Yeah, this was our first look at the other new map, 6-star hardpoint at least. And immediately the thing that jumped out to me is the pool / underwater hardpoint is absolute comedy. It was played a couple times in the matches this weekend, and there was just, with the game mechanics of you can only use your pistol when you're in the water, and it looked like in some fights guys were aiming right at people, but because of the way the underwater fights worked, they weren't even getting hit reg or anything. It was just absolute comedy, and some of this, like, even the commentators were saying in some points, like, these guys have a perk on that's letting them stay underwater for 30 seconds without having to come up for air and stuff like that. So that was really, I thought the map looks nice, and it was definitely a breath of fresh air to have another new map in there. Going to be interesting to see how it plays out long term, but for sure the underwater hill stood out to me. And I feel like there was already some initial rumors and stuff of people saying that needs to be changed, and obviously it's unlikely to, at least in my opinion, it's probably unlikely to be changed before Major 3 at this point, unless there's some emergency patch. But it feels like that's something that's gonna have to be looked at, because some of the gunfights and the contesting and all that was pretty funny.
No, they can't change it. Like, there's no way, because I need a little bit of comedy, a little comedic relief in competitive COD, and seeing Purge and I think it was Assault or something try to basically throw water balloons at each other at that point and not get any hit reg. That actually works out for me. I'm cool with that. I'm sure the players don't really enjoy it, but to hell with them. We're gonna stick with it.
Yeah. But outside of the 6-star, it was, kind of what we expected from Vegas in this one, especially like we had mentioned, the difference between LAG on LAN versus LAG online. And Geo played pretty well throughout the whole series, especially in map 1, while Attach went 25-9 in map 3. So pretty strong performance for Vegas here.
Saturday, April 13th, we first started off with a match between LAG and Toronto. Another 3-0 sweep in favor of Toronto. Well, really a 3-0 sweep against LAG. So they go 0-6 in map count, back to online form, peak online form. These maps weren't like, huge blowouts, but there weren't like really, really close maps either. Any thoughts? I mean, Toronto, it's good that they kind of get a boost after, a somewhat disappointing Major 2 performance, and kind of a, lackluster end to the Major 2 qualifiers. But it is also LAG online. It's kind of an expected result at this point.
Yeah, the thing that stood out to me in this one, I can't remember. It might have been Miles and Chance who casted this one, but regardless, I feel like I remember. I meant to put it in the notes, but I forgot that. They were kind of talking about the narrative somewhat around Toronto, at least at the end of last major, was around Envoy struggles. There was other stuff too, but
Mm,
well, that was one of the key takeaways from the tournament. And first map of his return to action here against LAG goes 9-26 against LAG. Um, by far the worst performance statistically in that entire map. And then he ends up going 12-4 in map 2, so literally had 3 more kills in a search than he did in a whole hard point. So not sure what to make out of that. It's just kind of a something to keep an eye on continually here for Toronto, especially as we head into Toronto's big showdown this coming weekend.
yeah. Well, I don't want to, say this is going to happen, but Toronto did make a surprising roster change last year when they moved Hixie. I think, really like a month and a half after they had won a major. If I'm not, or no, that excuse me, they made the roster change in the off season after they had won a major, got to the grand finals of champs and all that. So Toronto, who knows what they're kind of expecting, but obviously Envoy, in terms of his individual performance, probably could do better. And I'm not sure what the difference is from Major One, where they were incredibly dominant, to now where this is obviously not a great example because they were very dominant as a team, but what we saw in the qualifiers of Major Two and in Miami at Major Two, just not really indicative of the Toronto that I thought we were going to be expecting after Major One. But we'll see what happens coming up this week. Boston versus Miami was definitely the most entertaining match, at least up until this point. It was the middle match on Saturday. Boston really, for the first 3 maps, outplayed Miami, but losing that first hard point, the second map, Karachi S&D, they lose in round 11. They blow a lead. They still win control. They take a 2-1 lead, and then they lose Vista hard point, and they lose high rise search. So Boston in their debut match with Beans and Pentagram coming into the roster, Pentagram's CDL debut, it does not end up with a victory. Real, who made his Miami debut, really had a great game. Anything jump out to you? Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about Boston over the past week or two. So a lot of people were watching the result of this one.
Yeah, and I think that you kind of did a nice job summarizing it. Around 11 away from potentially winning your first match in the build around Snoopy era, if we want to call it that. 3-0, but it's tough to say they're around 11 away too when they had a 5-2 lead. So they had 4 opportunities to close it out, and
Yeah.
they choked a 5-2 lead. But yeah, they lose 2 searches, and Miami gets their first win in what feels like a very long time. I'd have to go back and look it up, but um, that's got to feel good for them and good for Real as well too, because we've talked at length about his story and journey this year with the visa issues and whatnot. So that's got to feel good for him to have a strong performance too and get that win. 94 kills led the way for Miami for and a 1.25 KD. And I know obviously some of the narratives and discussion around Boston involving Snoopy don't necessarily correlate to statistical performances. It's more about in-game knowledge and chemistry issues and whatnot. But for the sake of being fair and just stating the stats for what they are, Snoopy had a pretty good statistical performance in this one with 101 kills, 101 and 87 for a 1.16 KD. So most kills in the match as well. So um for, we talked at length last episode about the Boston camp and, seemingly putting their jobs and futures on the line to build around Snoopy. It's certainly from those numbers, at least, you can't say you can't put this one on him. Obviously, you can go back and watch the games and probably micro, uh, you know super detailed breakdown some stuff and be like, oh, he should have picked up this spawn, or he should have pushed up his route there, yada yada. But end of the day, it's when he's dropping 101 kills, he's you feel like he's probably doing his job. So it's tough loss for Boston, especially when, like you said, 5-2 lead in the map 2 could have been a 3-0 very easily. But shout out to the Heretics for getting back in the win column here.
I think Snoopy's going to get kind of the Dashy treatment. Granted, they're obviously not the same type of player or anything, but Dashy gets a lot of criticism, at least over the past few years, because he'll drop numbers, but then OpTic will not win championships. And he gets blamed a lot of times for that, as if he's the only player that gets kills and doesn't win championships. I don't remember people really criticizing Octane when he was on the Seattle Surge that much about it. But that, I think that is kind of, once people have a narrative about you and they've made up their opinion. And in some cases, and actually in Snoopy's case, I think a lot of people have made up their opinion on him, and the opinion is not necessarily the most positive at the moment. So people have made up their opinion, and they're going to find evidence to support that opinion, regardless of if that evidence really is truly, in existence. Like you said, he played statistically a very good game, but I'm sure there are people saying that, he's kill whoring, he's not actually contributing in meaningful ways, blah, blah, blah. I'm not as knowledgeable as the people that actually have to make these decisions and have to come to these conclusions. And frankly, a lot of the people that are going to make up their minds or have made up their minds about Snoopy are not that intelligent either. And they probably think that, whatever X says on a podcast or whatever, that is correct. I mean, we'll see what happens. I don't necessarily think Boston in general is a very strong team. I don't think that roster is, some incredible source of talent, and that's probably going to be his undoing. I don't think that they're going to win a ton of matches. I think losing to Miami is probably a good indicator of that, even with Real, and he did play really, really well. But at the same point, Miami is still going to be one of the, they're going to be a bottom 6 team most likely, and possibly even a bottom 4 team. And Boston losing even a match to them is not a great sign, but at least we'll have a little bit more time to kind of sit with that. Maybe Boston will be able to improve. Granted, this is Pentagram's literally first CDL match ever. This is Bean's first match back after playing in the CDL last year, and the first match for this team in general as a CDL roster. So it's going to be probably there will be some growing pains, but it is not a good time. It's kind of the LAG thing, like I said last week. People are there to criticize. They're waiting for Boston to fail, and they're kind of hoping for it. And at least this match was kind of like an appetizer, and it did seem like it might be trending that way. But granted, there will be many more matches, a lot more time for that to come to be. Last match on Saturday, New York versus Minnesota. No real surprises here. Minnesota does end up taking a 6-3 win on High Rise Search. New York, they had a really tough test, despite, they won, but it wasn't the cleanest. It wasn't the smoothest victory. 2 tight hard points. They lose that search. Invasion and Control, they win in 4. I kind of just talk about, I guess, Gunless and Standy in Minnesota. They put up a really good fight against New York, who is undoubtedly one of the top 4 teams. A much better performance out of them on this match than in their first one. Is that kind of indicative of like FaZe just being so much better than New York, or is that more Minnesota is better? This was a better kind of indication of where they are than their performance against FaZe.
That's where my head's at, more towards the latter. I'd say, this has me at least a little more excited to see Minnesota play against non-top four teams coming up here. Um, Obviously, they got 6-0'd, absolutely smoked, blown out in every single map this weekend against New York and Atlanta. It would be tough to say that regardless, but like you mentioned, there's some close maps here, and especially the first hard point against FaZe in combination with the maps in this New York series. There's some potential there for Minnesota. Not saying this team's a contender by any stretch of the imagination right now, but I feel like it would be possible for them to jump into that 5 to 8 range for teams if this squad is able to hang with these guys. But at the end of the day, we're still going to have to see how they play against those other teams around them towards the bottom of the stage.
Yeah, totally agree. It doesn't really matter what Minnesota, Miami, Carolina, etc. It doesn't matter what they do against New York or FaZe or OpTic or Toronto, because those aren't the teams that they're really competing with anyway. Those four teams are competing amongst themselves. The other 8 teams, they're competing amongst themselves, and they all have to kind of scratch and claw to get, especially out of the bottom 4, make champs at the end of the season, and then anything on top of that is a bonus right now. And Minnesota, it's unfortunate that they've started 0-2, but again, like I said earlier in the show, there's really only they can only go up from here, unless they have OpTic in Toronto. Then it's kind of like, oh, we just kind of got screwed by the schedule, and we'll get it back on another weaker schedule.
That's what I mean. Realistically, any roster that Minnesota was realistically able to put together for this week is going 0-2, unless they somehow were able to buy out Atlanta FaZe's whole roster or something like that. It's really tough to see any scenario where any squad they were able to put together with 4 players that they could realistically, have had, yeah, it's tough to imagine any scenario there where they're able to get the wins. But I do have to say that, you know, outside of a couple lopsided maps to FaZe, the first map there, the first hard point, and the other maps against New York do have me a little hopeful for this Minnesota squad. But again, we're gonna have to see how they do against those other squads.
So we move to Sunday, April 14th. First match, Seattle versus Carolina, which I think I was looking forward to it just to kind of see where these two teams are in relation to each other. 0-4 coming in, playing making his CDL debut. This Seattle roster has had, a lot of ups and downs, more downs than ups so far this season. Carolina, despite not having as much turmoil, definitely been, I don't even know if they're a disappointment, because I definitely didn't really expect a whole lot. But they're fighting to make sure that they're not in the bottom 4 of the league. So this was going to be a good litmus test for either one of these teams. Seattle ends up winning this. They avoid getting reverse swept. They win the first 2 maps. They lose control. They lose the second hard point, and they ultimately win 6-3 on 6-star S&D to close out this game. The KDs are hilarious. No Seattle Surge player had a better KD than 0.94. 3 of the 4 Royal Ravens players had a 1.13 KD or better. Fellow was the only non-positive KD player on Carolina, and yet they still lost. Before we get to Seattle, I need to bring it up about Carolina because it has been a trend all season. The search, it's just not there. I think it might be time to call it on Carolina's search potential. We've given them quite a bit of leeway, quite a bit of time to get it together. They are simply not a good search and destroy team, and I think it's actually going to be the reason that they're not going to make champs ultimately this season. I'm not sure what you think, because this has been kind of almost a running gag of sorts of like, let's see how they round into form with S&D, but it just hasn't worked out so far.
to play devil's advocate, this is two searches against Seattle, who this season, in any iteration of the roster, search has by far been their best mode, even when they were really struggling last set, major two qualifiers and major two. Search was still their best mode. So that's what I was gonna bring up, was that this could be somewhat of a return to form in search and destroy for Seattle, and it could just be bad timing for Carolina in that regard. But end of the day, this was still a match I expected Carolina to win. Just they had a chemistry advantage coming into this one, just being a roster together longer. I think they said on the broadcast that TJ hasn't moved yet, or one of the players, I can't remember for sure, which is kind of bad because this was like 5 hours ago. But I don't think everybody is in the Carolina facility yet, which is obviously what we were kind of looking forward to from the Carolina camp heading into the Major 3 qualifiers here, was finally getting the squad all together in person and seeing if that could help out with online results. But yeah, we'll keep an eye on Carolina's search still against these other teams who might not be as strong at search as Seattle, but that's still tough to say because it's still a match that you expect. At least I expected Carolina to win here. So, yeah, I guess potential turnaround for Seattle here is interesting. The one thing, obviously, outside of the KDs, the one thing that I really sat back and thought about after the win that I don't think I really mentioned before when we were talking about the roster changes and stuff is that it's obviously not a two-person change made by Seattle, but it kind of to some extent is like a 1.5 person change, in the sense that bringing in 04 for Arcides also allowed Abuza to move to the main AR, which is the role that we had heard so much about him in last year and heading into the season being like his where he shined and where he played well. And then obviously there was all this discussion around him coming into Seattle and potentially being the second sub, and then obviously the meta didn't really shake out that way at the start of the year, so it didn't matter too much. But now we're at a point now where he can be the main AR unquestioned, and that could be something that allows Abuza to shine a little bit or potentially pick things up in terms of his individual performance in his rookie year. So that's something I'm going to be keeping an eye on too, as well as just 04's performance. And also, indirectly due to the change, but at this point in his career, you might expect it is Hook is now the unquestioned leader on this team, in my eyes at least. He's the most veteran player, but he's never been someone who's like a vocal leader. He's always been like that quiet kid, the silent assassin, if you will. And that could be an interesting development in Hook's career, which has obviously had a ton of twists and turns over the years. So there's a lot to look for here in this Seattle team as I'm talking about it. So that's kind of exciting. And after all the struggles and the drama around the Major 2 stuff, Vanilli and all that, it's definitely got to feel good for those guys to get a win on the board. So going to be keeping an eye on them, but yeah, definitely one I expected Carolina to win, and we'll have to see how they respond as well.
I think what's going to be interesting with Seattle, or excuse me, with Carolina going forward, is how their 6-star S&D develops, because they're kind of Seattle's a bad matchup for them in terms of search, because Carolina's best search map in terms of record at least is Invasion, and that is also Seattle. They've played that the most this season, tied with Terminal, which is now out of the rotation. And Carolina's worst maps in terms of search, Terminal and Skid Row. It's they don't have to deal with that anymore. So 6-star is really going to be what they have to rely on to really take the next step to get out of the bottom 4, stay out of the bottom 4. Maybe I was a little harsh, but I still think that Carolina, they're going to have to somewhat consistently win search maps to make sure, because Hardpoint is not really a point of strength. Control is not really a point of strength. So you have to be at least mediocre in these three game modes to even have a chance at winning most of the time. And I think it's going to be really difficult for them, especially, I'm not sure how good Seattle will be in search with this new lineup, if it will be as strong or even stronger than it was before, but remains to be seen. This was the most surprising result. Seattle beating Carolina was, that's, unexpected, but I predicted it, so it's not that unexpected. Vegas versus LAT. LAT played pretty bad at Major 2. They did not show up to the degree that they did in the qualifiers, but they came to play today against the Vegas Legion. They ended up winning the series 3-2. They avoid which it would have been a very brutal reverse sweep if it had happened, because this was, I think, the most lopsided hardpoint win of the season. The opening game of this series, 250-49 in favor of LAT on 6-star hardpoint. They win the search, and then they lose 3-2 invasion control. They lose by 3 points on Vista hardpoint, and they end up clutching 6-star S&D, but it would have been probably the most embarrassing reverse sweep of the season had they lost. But instead, it is a pretty shocking loss for the Legion, who have been, they've played probably their best Call of Duty in franchise history over the last month or so. This is probably the most that they've won consistently, and yet they dropped this game or this match. And Nero, he totaled 100 kills in this series on top of that, and a 1.25 KD, and they still lose this match. Your thoughts on this 3-2 win for LAT over Vegas?
Yeah, another nice summary out of you. I definitely was very surprised by this result. But I did say last week that picking Vegas to go 2-0 inevitably meant they weren't going to go 2-0.
Yeah.
So despite picking them, it feels right that they weren't able to seal the deal here. But yeah, I'm especially, I know it's a new map in the rotation, but seeing a 50-point club out of LAT, who we have mentioned numerous times on this podcast have struggled in hardpoint this year throughout every iteration of the roster we've seen from them. That was pretty surprising to me, but that could be a sign that, especially the second hardpoint in this series they lose, but it's a 250-247 one, so could be a sign of improved hardpoint out of LAT, which is, something, a positive to take away that LAT fans are probably excited about. But yeah, I was definitely expecting Vegas to take this one, especially after a strong performance against LAG earlier in the week. But wouldn't be a CDL week if we didn't have some quote unquote upsets. So shout out LAT for getting the job done here. Definitely wasn't expecting it, and it's another one where a team is able to take 2 searches to close out the match. And obviously, as search and destroy fans, I myself, at least I know you kind of do, but me to probably more of a degree, I appreciate when teams are able to win 2 searches and take the series. So yeah, we'll have to see where either team is able to respond to this one. On the desk and stuff before this match, they were kind of calling Vegas the gatekeeper of the top 4, but that was kind of weird, because that would insinuate that LAT was Vegas is in the top 4 themselves. So it was they were kind of just saying, like, they're technically they viewed as the 5th best team right now, and just you got to get past Vegas to be in consideration for that 5th spot, I guess. But that is an interesting idea, and it kind of, end of the day, especially with this result here, further just illustrates that it's really the top 4 and then just everybody else below.
When you say the gatekeeper with Vegas, I picture a drunk man that is supposed to be protecting, like guarding a gate. Sometimes he's awake and he's gonna give you a fight. Other times he's too drunk and he's falling asleep in front of the gate and you can just walk by him. That's kind of what
It's like the
Vegas looks like right
you
now.
know that meme that's the security guy at like a football game or whatever. He's kind
Yeah.
of just like he does this.
All right. Yep. That is Las Vegas right now. I don't necessarily disagree that they're like the gatekeeper because I think they are of the bottom 8 probably the most consistent, but they are consistently inconsistent as well. They're not like a solid team right now. But compared to the other teams that are making roster changes, trying to figure out anything that they can remotely put together on a consistent basis, yeah, they look pretty solid compared to them. But I think there is no better encapsulation of this CDL season than this match, where these two teams are probably going to make champs. If I had to bet that these two teams are going to be two of the top 8, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were like 5 and 6 at this point. And yet LAT, who could not buy a hardpoint map earlier in the year, is beating Vegas by 201 points in this opening hardpoint. And this was still a 3-2 series. So it wasn't like LAT just blitzed them in the beginning and they demoralized Vegas and it was over really shortly. No, like Vegas was like, oh yeah, like we dropped a hardpoint map to possibly the worst or one of the worst hardpoint teams this season. We'll just fight back and we'll force a game 5 and still lose. So somehow both of these fan bases are probably a little bit disappointed today, but LAT ends up winning. This is a good win. They are much better online so far this season. I think they won 3 or 4 matches last time around. Now they just got to put it together on LAN, try to get some of those CDL points at the major, which is even more important than doing it online. But we'll see what happens in like 4 or 5 weeks whenever we finally get to another major. Two teams that actually have a chance at winning the championship this year. They finished out the week of qualifiers. So we've done this at least a few times where we have a bunch of kind of decent matchups, more competitive matchups because those teams aren't particularly solid. And then we finish out with teams that are competitive near the top of the standings. And that's what we did this week with OpTic versus Atlanta, a rematch of the Major 2 Grand Finals, rematch of, was that the winners finals as well? So this is now the second time in a matter of 3 weeks, or third time, excuse me, in a matter of 3 weeks that these teams have played each other. And for another time this year, Atlanta FaZe has defeated OpTic Texas. I believe Atlanta is now 6-0 against OpTic this year, and we talked about it kind of at length over the past few episodes. OpTic had dominated Atlanta for pretty much like 2 years. Atlanta could not beat OpTic really at all, and that is completely flipped with Draza now in the lineup. And despite PRED being part of this team, despite Kenny being a part of this team, Atlanta has their number, and I'm not exactly sure what's going on with that. Your thoughts on this? A 3-1 win for Atlanta FaZe over OpTic.
And on an unserious note, we might have to, evaluate it. Everyone's saying like Kenny or Draza is Kenny's son. Like at this point, it might be the other way around. But on a more serious note, these maps were all incredibly close, and I think that's just that was a theme in OpTic and Atlanta's matches at Major 2 as well. I don't have those scores on me right now, but I just remember like saying that the 2 series they played were super entertaining, really down to the wire, and I'm pretty sure that there was 2 terminal S&Ds that OpTic won that were both round 11 if I remember correctly. So like despite Atlanta having an edge in the overall series count this year, at least in the last 3 series, they've been really close, hard fought series, and you could have made a case that OpTic could have won today as well. Like the control, I really think OpTic had a really good opportunity. I think it was the second round they were on offense, I believe, and they kind of weren't able to get the last set of kills needed. They had a numbers advantage in the life department, and uh, Atlanta kind of just dwindled it away, and then they weren't able to, time expired. They weren't able to get the capture or finish off Atlanta's lives. But OpTic could have won that one, and then obviously the map four was really close as well, and the search too. I don't know what the lead was, but I feel like OpTic had like a 4-2 lead or something like that, and maybe it was only a 3-2 lead. I don't know, but regardless, it was a really close series at the end of the day. And I think I was kind of thinking about it at the time when the match was watching. Even if OpTic won this series, I don't think it would have been like, it definitely wouldn't have been like a red flag for Atlanta or anything in my eyes, because, it's online, and at the end of the day, they just beat them twice on LAN before this, and there's new maps and stuff like that. But it would have been a big confidence booster, I feel like, for OpTic if they were, 5-0, 0-5 for OpTic heading into this one. They were able to just take this one and, get over the hump and get that win against Atlanta. It could have done a lot for their confidence and, morale heading into a potential rematch with them at Major 3 in some form. But now it's kind of like at the same time, FaZe has just been dominant against them, even if the individual maps are so close. And it's like, if they do match up at Major 3, is like Atlanta already ahead in the mental, facet of the game, where it's like we beat them 6 times, and OpTic's like stressing we're 0-6 against them. What do we got to do to, you know, get that first series win? So I don't know exactly how much we can take away from this, other than it was a really entertaining and another hard fought series between two top teams. And if we get this matchup, 4 or 5 more times this year, regardless of the result, I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same, individual maps that are super close every single time. So I think that's my bigger takeaway, regardless of the end result for Atlanta, is just another hard fought close series between these two teams. And I'd sign up for that every other time we see these squads face off this year.
Yeah, so I think FaZe is like 19-6 in terms of map count against OpTic this season. I'm not 100% on that. I'm almost positive they were 15-5 before this week. I seem to remember that us talking about that record in general after the major. But 6-0, only one of these series has went to a game 5. The grand finals from Major 2, which was a best of 7, only went to a 5th map. FaZe won 4-1. And in the last 3 matchups, so the 2 at the second major and this matchup today, OpTic has only won 1 respawn map. They won 2 search maps, 1 in the winners finals, 1 in the grand finals. But today was the first time that OpTic had won a respawn map in those matches. So it's been a rough go for OpTic against FaZe. FaZe, they have had OpTic's number. They have now won 19 to 25 maps this season against OpTic. OpTic has only won 1 respawn in the last 3 matches, which is I think 12 maps. So it's been a really rough go for OpTic against this particular team, a team that, despite OpTic not winning a bunch of championships over the years, they've had FaZe's number since really FaZe won the world championship. I don't know what the difference is. Really, like, obviously there's so much talent on both of these teams. I don't think that can be denied. Like, I think in terms of talent, these are two. I would say that at least in total talent, I would say that they're the most talented teams in the league. Granted, there's a ton of talent on New York, as same for Toronto, but when I think of kind of like all-star, superstar, mega teams, I think of OpTic, I think of FaZe. But FaZe has just been, not dominant in terms of they're just crushing OpTic over and over and over again. Like you said, all of the maps today were pretty close. All of the maps really at Major 2 were really close. In the winners finals, the hardpoint maps combined, they were separated by 26 points. It was a 13-point win for FaZe in both the first hardpoint and second hardpoint out series. The searches were incredibly close, like you mentioned. 2 round 11 victories for OpTic on Terminal in search. And then obviously FaZe won the final search of that grand final series. But again, that was a 6-4 win. Most of these controls are going to round 5s. I don't know, maybe OpTic will get discouraged by just losing over and over and over again to this one team. And it's the classic OpTic loss today. They outslayed FaZe by quite a bit. Dashy had a 1.28. Shotzi and Dashy combined had 200 kills in this series. Abizi dropped a 0.84, and FaZe still won. It didn't even go to a map 5. I don't know. I wish I had an answer for OpTic. I'm sure OpTic fans wish they had an answer for themselves, but that's just how it goes. FaZe is by far the best team this season, and right now OpTic is not that far away, but it feels like they're a lot farther than they might be, just because they haven't been able to even get one win so far.
Hot off the presses, JP, who's an analyst and coach for OpTic, just tweeted at 9:14, GG's FaZe, they capitalized on our mistakes. Expanding our map pool is not an excuse. Winnable maps and situations, a good rep to learn from. And I think at the end of the day, that's really a good mindset to have for this scenario. And I think that's where my head's at as well for OpTic is, it is kind of like you mentioned, they did get a respawn win here, and it's on one of those new maps, but you don't want to make excuses. Even like we were mentioning earlier, there were, especially in the control, winnable situations just didn't go their way, and it's back to the drawing board. So I think, kind of like you said, I like how you rounded it out and saying FaZe is the best team. OpTic might not be super far apart, and might not, especially in the grand scheme of the CDL compared to all the other teams. They're up there in the top 4 undisputed, potentially in the top 2 because they were in the grand finals and they're still playing FaZe close, but they just aren't the best team and they haven't beaten FaZe yet. And we're going to have to see what it takes for them to, cross the finish line if they want to get to where the green wall expects OpTic to be at the major events and whatnot.
And it's a part of being great teams that you play them close despite not necessarily winning all the maps. It's kind of rare to see 2 really good teams play each other and it's just like a total beatdown by one side. Even if it's a sweep, usually some of those maps are pretty close, and it just comes down to one team clutching up in the moments that they need to. And that's kind of what's been happening with FaZe, but it's been happening over and over again for them against OpTic, which begs the question of if that isn't a structural issue with OpTic. Is there something that they need to change to kind of get over that hump, or is it like they'll just keep progressing, they'll keep getting better? Obviously, this OpTic roster, I'll give them an excuse. This OpTic roster, half of it is new, this season. Granted, they've had a few months now, and it's not really an excuse, but FaZe, 3/4 of this team have played together for like 4 years, 5 years now. Simp and Abizi have been together for just over 5 years, which is, I think, it's definitely the longest in the CDL, but it's one of the longest teammate duos in COD history. OpTic really doesn't have that. Shotzi and Dashy have been together, but there's been some turmoil where Dashy's getting benched last season for whatever, like a day and a half, and then he gets brought back. So, OpTic still trying to figure out things, and they're in a really good position anyway, because it doesn't matter how you do in April necessarily. It matters what you do in June, in July, and whatever champs ends up being. That's really when it's going to matter, because no one's really going to remember FaZe beating OpTic if OpTic wins a championship, and it won't matter at all. So, Greenwall, calm down. It'll be okay. That does it for the matches from last week. So pick 'em. So far this season, we both went 6-2. Vegas betrayed us as usual, and then you picked Carolina over Seattle, and I picked Boston over Miami. So two of the surprising results this week got us, but both went 6-2, and I had a 2-game edge going in. So I'm 86-42 on the season. You're 84-44, and Trimmer is 0-1 on the season. Major 3 week 2 qualifiers. There is 1 additional match. So I think there were 8 last week. We have 9 qualifier matches this week. 3 on Friday, 3 on Saturday, and 3 on Sunday. Starting with Friday, April 19th, we have Carolina versus New York. I just talked about how Carolina is not a good search team. New York is a pretty good team regardless of the game mode. So I'm going to go with the subliners.
I'm going New York too, but we got to remember Carolina was the team that beat them at Major 1. But I think they've played again since then, and New York might have won. But yeah, regardless, there is some history in this matchup that favors Carolina a little bit, but I'm gonna go with the subliners.
Father versus son, Hydra versus Clayster. So we'll see how that works out. Seattle versus OpTic. Despite Seattle beating Carolina this week, I need to go with OpTic just for my own sanity.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with OpTic too.
Miami versus Toronto. Again, I think it's fair to say that Toronto is the favorite there.
I'm taking Ultra as well.
Saturday, April 20th. This match could be interesting. LAT versus Miami. Miami winning last week was a surprise. LAT in the fashion that they won was a surprise. I'm going to go with LAT because they've shown some proficiency in each game mode now, even though I'm still a little bit skeptical of how proficient they are, but I'm going to go with the Thieves.
That's where my head's at too. I'm taking LAT, and I'm going with the mindset of Miami just beat Boston, LAT just beat Vegas. In my head, Vegas is a better team than Boston, so I'm going with LAT over Miami, the 2 1-0 teams. But Miami will likely be 1-1 at the time. If Miami beats Toronto before this one, then they're the Vamos is fully back and they probably win this. But otherwise, I'm going to go with LAT.
If Toronto loses to Miami, do you want to automatically switch your pick?
No.
Yeah, I think it's a little too much, because if they beat Toronto, they're definitely losing to the Thieves. That's just like the natural order of things. Vegas versus OpTic is the second match on Saturday. OpTic, of course.
Yep, I'm taking OpTic.
In New York versus Seattle, again, it's a matchup between one of the top 4 and possibly one of the bottom 4. So I'm gonna go with the subliners.
Yep, I'm taking New York.
Sunday, April 21st, an interesting one.
Hanger.
the Blow It Up Bowl, possibly. Carolina versus LAG. LAG has probably not won an online match since like Clayster was in diapers, so I'm gonna go with Carolina.
Yeah, I hate to have all chalk so far, but I'm gonna go with Carolina as well.
Boston versus Minnesota up next. I'm gonna go with Boston.
Ooh.
I think it's one of those teams.
Snoopy.
Yeah, I over the time that we've hosted the Ego Chall Podcast, I've had my teams that I've kind of ridden right into the ground like a dying horse. LAG comes to mind. The Paris Legion come to mind. And I think Boston is that team this season. So I'm riding with Snoopy. I'm team Snoopy. I'm team anti-slasher at the moment. I'm riding with Doug, Sensor Martin. I'm going with the Boston Breach.
And I'm going with Minnesota. And I feel like any of our listeners or watchers up of this episode up to this point can see where my head's at with this one because, like I was kind of saying, Minnesota with the new squad went 0-2 against New York and Atlanta, but they had some close fights, and I want to see what they're capable of against teams not in the top four. And this is the first chance we're going to get to see Minnesota, how they stack up against the team towards the bottom of the standings. So expecting Minnesota to pull this one out.
Last match of the week. We actually end on a banger, just like we did last week with OpTic versus FaZe. We have FaZe versus Ultra. These teams have not played since, I believe it was week 3 of the Major 2 qualifiers, which was a 3-1 win for Atlanta. Before that, they played at Major 1 twice. Toronto won both of those series, 7-2 map count combined. That was obviously, Ultra. What was that?
It wasn't. Didn't Atlanta 3-0 Toronto?
Did I say that reverse?
You said 3-1 for their last matchup.
Oh, yeah, it was 3-0. I just said it wrong. So 3-0 last time out, which was about 5-6 weeks ago. That was the last time they played. Major 1, Toronto won both of the series, the winners finals and the grand finals combined 7-2 map count. But different teams, they've kind of flipped. FaZe seemed a little bit vulnerable earlier in the season, losing to Toronto. Toronto looks a little bit more vulnerable now. FaZe has looked unstoppable essentially for the last, few weeks at least, since Major 2, and looked really good this week. So who do you have? Atlanta versus Toronto to finish out week 2.
And we got the beef between Draza and Scrap. And I can tell you one thing, regardless of who wins this match. Well, today, obviously, we did the podcast almost immediately after OpTic versus Atlanta ended, and I closed out of the stream and didn't listen to the post-match interview. I can promise you that at the end of next week's matchup, regardless of whichever team wins, I am listening to that post-match interview because it's going to be spicy either way, I feel like. And I got to go with Atlanta here. I really hope this is just a banger series, but at the same time, if one of these teams 3-0s the other, then the timeline's going to be on fire, and this has the makings of just being an absolute banger, regardless of the actual result on the server, and I'm here for it.
I'm just going to try to be different. I think FaZe will win because I believe FaZe is the best team in the world. At the moment, obviously things can definitely change over the next few months, but FaZe for the last month or so, OpTic had their moments in the Major 2 qualifiers. I think they went 6-1 or whatever, maybe 7-0 in the Major 2 qualifiers. They looked really good, and FaZe beat them twice at Major 2. I believe Atlanta beat New York as well at Major 2, and they didn't get a chance to beat Toronto at Major 2. So that's kind of like the loophole right now is, Atlanta hasn't played Toronto on land since Major 1, and we might not get that until, we're definitely not going to get that until at least Major 3, but possibly it'll take until Major 4 champs for that to actually happen. But I'm going to go with Toronto. I think that they're pretty evenly matched, but I think Atlanta has the edge. I don't want to go like almost entirely chalk except like one match. So I'll go with Toronto, but people can praise me for how smart I am if Atlanta wins still.
All right.
But yeah, that does it for today's show. We did our predictions. Again, Bink 84-44 on the season. I'm 86-42 and Trim 0-1 on the season. And we will be back next week. Possibly next Sunday, the live show, and then Monday morning, you guys will get as the thunder hits and scares the crap out of me. Oh God! So get out of here before I get sucked up into a tornado or something. But we'll be back early next week, to talk about the matches, and then give our predictions for week 3 of the qualifiers. But before I was about to do my intro. So make sure to subscribe, follow, or like the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, preferably give a thumbs up on the videos for YouTube. We did have, a few comments on our latest YouTube video, which was awesome to see. Really appreciate the support. You guys can follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, podcasters at Ego Chall Podcast. And again, the next show will likely be next Sunday in terms of the live show, which you can watch on twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast or the YouTube channel. And then the podcast, feed will be updated, sometime Monday morning. The YouTube channel, the VOD will be up there at the same time as well. But yeah, that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, I was going to shout out the YouTube comments too. There was one really nice one in particular last episode. So shout out you guys watching on YouTube and whatnot. Thank you guys as always for all the support. And yeah, before we lose power again, thank you guys as always. And remember to send the chall.